Hello, I'm Harry Cole, political editor of The Sun, and this is Never Mind the Ballots. The Tories head to Birmingham for their crunch conference that will see the four candidates to replace Rishi Sunak go head-to-head in a beauty parade. We're joined today by a man who knows a thing or two about the Conservative Party and their last 14 years in power. As the dust settles on the election wipeout, what went wrong and why? Lord Brady, the ultimate man in a grey suit. As his new book describes him, the Kingmaker. He's here to lift the lid. Graham Brady, welcome to Never Mind the Ballots.
Thank you very much.
You were the chairman of the 1922 committee, the backbench power brokers, for as long as I can remember. You spent all of those years not talking to journalists. I remember the amount of times I must have called you and you very politely told me where to go. Why are you lifting the lid now?
Well,
and you've got a few scores to settle.
I'm not settling scores. And in fact, I try to be very balanced. And I give a bit of credit as well. But look, I was always going to write a memoir. I think it's a story that's too good not to tell, frankly, especially after the last 14 years, which has been the most tumultuous time in British politics. And the number of people over the years who stopped me in the street to say, I hope you're going to write a book one day. And,
not at least me,
So I have had it in mind to do, but obviously why now? Well, I wasn't going to do it before the general election. I didn't want to make anything worse.
Of course.
So now I think it's a time when the party needs to reflect. I think it's a good thing to look at what we've done over the last 14 years, look at what might have been done better or differently, and so I hope it'll help that process.
We'll talk about the future in a moment, but let's talk about the past. You were in the room, really, for the sort of makings and breakings of every Prime Minister since David Cameron, really. Before we go back, I'd like to talk about each of them really in turn. But British politics, in my view, sort of started to go wrong. Well, obviously we had the coalition, which was new from 2010. But around the time of the Scottish referendum and Brexit, all the rules seemed to go out the window, really. What was it like being sort of the man that was the stickler for trying to keep the rules and trying to keep this sort of party that was at times, you know, too small to really sort of change direction, then too big to really have any grip on the direction? Just give us a flavour. What was it like trying to steward that? Well,
I mean, it was a strange experience. I say in the book, I went into politics wanting to excite people, and I ended up being the person who calmed everybody down. Yeah. And at various times, I think in particular around about the time of the withdrawal agreement votes in Parliament, when we had that awful period of neuralgia, and people would say to me, you know, I saw you come on to talk about it. And I thought, there's a bit of calm. So it's a strange role to end up performing. I hope I help people in some degree in that process. But I would say, you mentioned the coalition. Personally, I thought coalition was the wrong thing to do at the time. And of course, you can always play what ifs about history. But I think there's a very interesting set of what ifs. If we'd done minority government for a short period, then fought another election, which I think we would have won. And in fact, coalition is such an odd state in our tradition. So through the coalition years, as chairman of the 1922 committee, I was really the spokesman for the Conservative Party.
Keeping the flame alive.
Within the coalition.
And that must have put you on an awkward path. There's some amusing anecdotes in the book, but it put you on a collision path, really, with the man who didn't seem that reluctant to be in coalition, David Cameron, the first premier you dealt with. What was your relationship like? What were the highs? And we'll move on to those in a moment. Where was it good? Where was he a good prime minister?
Well, I mean, I think David Cameron was a good prime minister. He was very able. I mean, he famously said he wanted to be prime minister because he thought he'd be rather good at it.
Is that a good qualification for the job?
I do know. In terms of giving a bit of credit, I do say in the book, by and large, he was rather good at it. He certainly wore it lightly. He maintained a rather relaxed air. I mean, people did say sometimes he was the SA crisis prime minister.
Yeah, all the chillaxing,
and he would swing from, there were two positions. One was complacence and the other was panic. But by and large, it's a remarkable period of stability and calm until it wasn't. And, again, I say in the book, I think that the Brexit referendum probably only happened because we had a coalition government. And it's because the Conservative Party wasn't able to try to negotiate a new relationship with the EU because the Liberal Democrats wouldn't let us.
And the pressure just grew.
The pressure grew, and all David Cameron was able to promise was something in the next Parliament.
Did you think he was? Do you think he thought he was going to win the 2015 election? Because he was obviously very bullish about having a referendum in the run-up to.
I don't think he thought he was. I think he thought that there would be a further period of coalition. It had been, and it's understandable in a way, that for the Prime Minister and for the government, that coalition was a very easy thing to do because it just guaranteed that we would win every vote.
Yeah.
There was never going to be a serious problem. And the Conservative Party might sometimes be a more difficult coalition to manage than the coalition.
Absolutely, and where that first started to emerge was that original vote in 2011, where I think 81, yourself included, voted for a referendum. That must have put a lot of strain on your relationship with Dave.
Yes, and I mean I do recount the conversation that we had.
Give us a flavour of it.
And I think he was particularly annoyed that some of us had made sure that it was a call for not just a straight in or out referendum, but it also included the option that had been in the Conservative Party's manifesto, which was significant reform. So we said we should have a referendum seeking a mandate, either leave, stay, or stay but change it a lot. And I think he was quite cross about that because that's what garnered so much support.
So David Cameron, when he, obviously we all know what happened next. He got his, he lost his referendum. He put himself front and centre of it in a way that he didn't necessarily have to. Of all the sort of resignations you've dealt with from Prime Ministers, presumably that was the most sort of open and shut one, because he presumably he just phoned you up and said, I'm off.
He didn't phone me up.
He didn't phone you up to say that. He just said it.
I was doing the media round the morning after the referendum.
Yes.
All of the media thought that it was worth talking to me because whatever the result of the referendum, it was going to be really difficult for the Conservative Party. So I'd done everything from 5:45 onwards. I'd done the Today programme, the breakfast TV.
Did you have a missed call, or did he?
I didn't have a missed call.
He didn't even try to reach out.
I had told the Chief Whip that I was going to go out and bat for the Prime Minister, and I was live on BBC television on the green opposite, and I could see on the little TV monitor opposite, I could see the door of number 10 opening and walking out, and the caption, Cameron resigns, appearing. Whereupon I had to wheel instantly from saying how essential it was that David Cameron remain Prime Minister.
An elegant pivot, yeah.
I hope.
But that was an extraordinary morning, and because the Prime Minister had resigned, and it was still, I think it was the third item on the 8 o'clock news, the news that morning, because obviously Britain had voted to leave the EU. Carney had done his massive injection into the markets, and then the Prime Minister's gone. So you'd think that would be the sort of peak of the madness, that we'd never get a day like that again. But in many ways, that's just where the craziness started, right? In came Theresa May. Had a sort of, threw her weight around a little bit in that first year, was quite a strong leader, or definitely acted like one. She had her enforcers with her. And then it all went wrong again for the Tory party in 2017 with that election disaster. What was it like that night when it really looked like a Prime Minister could fall, and you had Jeremy Corbyn breathing on the cusp of Downing Street?
Indeed, terrifying thought.
Indeed. Well, I mean, you were there. How did you? What was it like?
Well, see, Theresa I'd worked with previously in opposition. We entered Parliament at the same time in 1997. We both made our maiden speeches in the same debate.
Yeah.
But I had a lot of time, a lot of respect for Theresa, but I never thought she would be leader of the party or Prime Minister. So when she became Prime Minister, and of course I announced that she'd become leader of the party and would therefore be Prime Minister, I was a bit surprised.
Yes.
But then I had a second surprise, which was suddenly, actually, it was working. And the British public took to her. I think they rather liked the fact that she was unshowy, that she wasn't slick like David Cameron, who'd been there before. They thought, we like this. This is steady and somehow very English. And it was working. But the trouble is that I think, the opinion poll lead lulled her into the unwise decision to hold an unnecessary general election.
Was it that unwise? I mean, if you actually look at where we were as a country, in terms of trying to negotiate Brexit with a commission that would still wanted to prod and see whether the country was serious about it, going into that with a majority of 12 or 16, whatever it got to by then, it did make sense to go for a bigger majority to be able to get. We all saw what happened when Parliament was deadlocked.
Yeah, I was very wary about that election because I thought the country was still too divided. There was a lot of friction still, and I didn't think it was a very healthy time to go back to a general election. But I do say that I think one of the odd things, again, if you're going to play the what-ifs of history, if we'd had Boris Johnson as Prime Minister in 2016, immediately after the referendum, I think he would have gone quickly over to Brussels. I think he would have said, look, this is what we want. EU citizens here are fine, don't worry about that. We'd like the same for our people in Europe. We want free markets, we want to carry on trading.
Which is basically where we ended up for 4 years later, 5 years later.
Pretty much where we ended up after the most painful period. And by delaying, I think the EU side suddenly started to think, oh, maybe we can stop them going.
And then we had Keir Starmer and all his mates trying to go for a second referendum, but that's all in the past now, isn't it? So Theresa May's premiership and the sort of really horrible slow bleeding out of it was where we really became the sort of famous figure of the man of letters.
Yes.
You know, every day we'd phone up you or Tory MPs and trying to work out, someone else has put a letter in this game, this 15% threshold to be reached. And obviously back then, I think it wasn't because not as small as it is now, but the parliamentary party was smaller than it was ultimately in 2019. I think it was 28 letters it had to get to, or
I think it was higher than that. It was 40 something.
40 something. There we go. Sorry, yeah. So we ended up having this sort of back and forth each time. How annoying was that? And how close did anyone actually ever get to the actual number? Because I remember when it finally was crossed, you could just feel it in the air. The sort of the sort of agitators, the Moggs and Steve Bakers of the world, worked out that they reckoned they got it over the line. But it took them a while, right?
Yes. And one of the things I do in the book, whilst I don't say who wrote to me unless they said it publicly themselves, I think that's only fair and decent. But I do give the timeline for those letters coming in. And what it shows is that generally my colleagues were actually very reluctant to do it. They thought it was a big step. They didn't want to cause unnecessary turmoil. And very often they had respect for the Prime Minister, the leader who'd been elected.
But then suddenly they did just come in a batch.
Suddenly things got too much.
Do you think Boris Johnson had a hand in that, where he was keeping some of his allies back to waiting when he was actually ready to fight the leadership campaign?
You'd have to ask him that. And I don't
He's coming on the show next week, so I'll ask him.
I'm sure you will.
But what's your hunch?
It's very hard. All I could tell was suddenly letters would start moving. And, I think at that point, actually Steve Baker's numbers were pretty good.
Right.
What they could never quite take account of, they might have counted people who'd said, I've put a letter in. People very rarely then said, and I've taken it out again since.
Yes. Did that happen a lot? So there was a bit sort of...
It happened a lot, and it happened at various different points. In those times when Theresa was trying to negotiate the withdrawal agreement, it happened because there were times when people thought, let's just give her a little bit of a chance.
Was there a couple of usual suspects who were sort of in out?
Yes.
Who are they?
And there was a standing joke about one of my colleagues. And
I think Andrew Bridgen's letter within him.
A colleague said there was a sort of pro forma letter that you'd just say, insert name here.
Anyone put a sort of undated one in and said, look, you decide when everything...
No, and I don't think I would have accepted that either.
Got you.
There were people who wrote me letters saying, if you get to the total, then add this.
Right.
And the logic of that, all I can think is they didn't want to cause the instability of triggering a confidence vote. But if there was a confidence vote, they wanted to make it very obvious
that they had been the letter in.
But they wanted to make it obvious as well that the numbers were against the incumbent.
God, they're a canny bunch, aren't they?
They can be a bit tricky.
So Theresa May eventually was gone. Boris Johnson comes in. There's that sort of weird 3 months of battling with Parliament before we finally get to this election. We finally sort of have this breakthrough. Things look like they could be going all right, finally got a deal, get Brexit done, all that jazz. Obviously a kind of horrid time within the Conservative Party when the sort of Cummings mantra of no quarter, no mercy, kick everyone out. What was that like? Did you have to be able to play sort of shop steward, trade union bossing? Some of the people you politically, I think, disagree with being booted out, but did you sort of have to represent them on behalf of the 22 itself?
Yes, and I think whilst it was perfectly reasonable in those circumstances to take the whip away from people who had voted for things often in concert with the Labour Party, very much against the government's central mission. So there was nothing unreasonable in taking the whip away, but there is a process. And there is a system that we have in place for a potential appeal not for the restoration of the whip, but for being put back on the candidates list so they could have fought the next election as a Conservative candidate again. So I did have a potential role in that. And I think it's
must have been quite a strange one, though, given your own personal views on Brexit and the sort of... How often did you have to park your own views and be...
Well, I think quite often, but what I tried to do right from the outset, because I thought it was the only plausible way of advising a Prime Minister in the role of chairman of the 1922 committee, I would be completely upfront. And sometimes I would say, this is what I think, and I believe it very strongly. And I think maybe you're wrong the direction you're going in. But my assessment is that 80% of the parliamentary party agrees with you, not me. And, so I just tried to be very upfront and very honest about those things.
So, obviously, COVID hits Britain like a wave, knocks the entire country, not just the entire country, the Johnson premiership completely off of kilter. That was another big place where you had, obviously, I think, deep disagreements.
Yes.
On principle with the lockdowns, the vaccine passports, the closing of the schools, the massive infringement of the state upon people's lives. Did you ever come close to thinking, I can't do this job and oppose this at the same time?
No, I didn't. But it was a classic case of where it was very clear, certainly for the beginning of the COVID period, my colleagues were happy to go along with the government.
The public pressure on it as well, though.
There was public pressure. There were about 30 to 40 of us who were standing up against some of those extreme restrictions from quite early on. And it took quite a long time for that number to grow to the point that we were actually able to stop the whole thing. And it was December 21, almost 2 years into it, when the government held that vote on so-called Plan B restrictions, which was effectively another lockdown that was going to cancel another Christmas. And 100 of us voted against. And at that point, I think Boris Johnson realised the balance in the party had moved and people understood it needed to change. And crucially, and this is the thing that would have been fascinating to find out if it had happened sooner, we stopped those restrictions from being implemented over Christmas 2021 and nothing happened.
Exactly. When did you realise Boris was toast?
I think that the Partygate problems were getting quite serious, and in the very early months of 2022, we saw a very steep trajectory of my colleagues writing me letters saying, look, I've tried, I was a supporter of Boris Johnson's, I've stood by him, but I can't do it anymore. And
obviously the threshold was much higher.
The threshold was 54, I think. But the letters were coming in quite strongly in January, February 2022, and then Putin invaded Ukraine. And there was a massive withdrawals of those letters.
Really? So when literally people were taking them out by the fistful?
And they were saying, look, we've got a war in Europe. The Prime Minister's quite rightly standing up for Ukraine, and he was very vocal in that. This is a time we should pull together behind the Prime Minister.
So you could make an argument then that had, obviously the Sue Gray report came a few months later, and the vote of confidence, which he survived. In that case, do you think if he had got a grip then, a proper grip, and not had the various other scandals, Pincher and co, and not lied, have a spokesman lie on the record about that sort of thing, do you think he could have survived? If the party were willing to give him the benefit of the doubt after all that?
My sense was that the so-called Partygate allegations were there. They'd made some people very angry. And we'd had very bad local election results in lots of places, not everywhere. But it was as though the whole thing was starting to simmer down. And then that most bizarre episode, and that it was really his handling of the Pincher affair that brought him down. And nobody could ever...
And you had the remarkable, we all remember that remarkable time where, it was that fight to stay, he'd just come back from NATO, G7, Chogham, lands on the Monday, the Pincher story breaks in the Sun. And then by Thursday, he's out on his ear.
Yes, amazing.
When did he... what was that like? It was obviously clear to you from quite early on he was done. When did the penny drop for him? Not right till the end?
Right till the end. So I saw him on the Wednesday evening and I told him what I thought was going to happen. We'd just had elections for a new 1922 executive committee. So in a sense, it was a committee with a fresh mandate. And I think...
an anti-Johnson mandate, presumably.
I think they were bound to vote to change the rules to allow another confidence vote.
Right, gotcha.
And if that happened, he was going to lose it. And I told him that in terms. And, I think to his credit, and I'm grateful for this because those are uncomfortable conversations, there was no personal animosity. He just said, thank you, you're doing your job, but I'm not going. And he was quite determined.
Do you reckon any Prime Minister, we've got to rattle through, we've got a couple more to rattle through yet, but do you think any Prime Minister can survive a confidence motion? Because it seems to me, John Major's the only one I can recall that managed to go on for more than 6 months or a year after it. Once it's out.
I think the problem is if you survive a confidence vote, but with 40 or more than 40% of your colleagues voting against, then it looks pretty rickety.
Yeah. So Liz Truss, we don't have to spend a much long time on this, but there was a couple of moments that you played a key part. Firstly, did you think before she won that it would end like that?
No. And again, I say in the book, there are many surreal moments when I think back, but one of them was that the first meeting that I had with her as Prime Minister, the item number 1 on my agenda was just to make sure that the 1922 committee's centenary dinner in February of the next year was in her diary, which
Fantastic.
it was. It never once crossed my mind that she would have been gone by February and it'd be a new Prime Minister.
The mini-budget happened. The Tory conference that year was one of the craziest I've ever been to. I think you went to see her before the 45p rate stuff and just said, what did you say?
Well, it was widely reported that I'd gone to tell her to...
reported by me, I think.
To forget the 45p rate, but of course I never said what I'd gone to see her about.
Yeah.
Actually, I was going about a broader concern, which was just my sense was the party was feeling very disjointed. Yeah. And in particular, the people who had not been her supporters, who were not reflected at all, not represented at all in the government.
You can imagine a world where Michael Gove, Grant Shapps, Sajid Javid had been brought into a Truss government and would be out there spinning the mini-budget to their heart's content if they had the right job, right?
Well, indeed. And instead, they felt they weren't part of it.
So eventually you went to see Liz. Obviously, I think she kind of realised it was up by the time you knocked on the door.
Yes. It was a very easy conversation in the end. So I went in, we sat down. She said, Graham, how bad do you think it is? I said, I think it's very bad. She said, I do too. And then she said, do you think it's recoverable? And retrievable? I said, no, I'm afraid I don't.
Was she in that sort of remarkable Zen-like stage then? Or was she still...
She seemed hugely relieved. I think the pressure on her had been so much over those few weeks. She decided to go and she seemed like the weight had been lifted.
Then obviously Rishi came in and tried to do exactly what the opposite to Liz and try and bring in different bits of the party. He kept on some Boris supporters like James Cleverly. A few of the Trussites survived. And he tried to really simmer everything down. Do you think that was the right move, ultimately, given it ended with the tonking it did? That, maybe if he hadn't...
I think trying to unite the party and bring everybody together at that point was sensible. My sense, of course, it was obvious he had two tasks. The first was to steady things. It was to stabilise the markets, recover our reputation for economic competence. And he did that with Jeremy Hunt. They did it very effectively. The second task, and this is all within what was going to be a very short period of time, no more than about 2 years, was going to be to take some risks and to do some things to excite people who might possibly vote Conservative. And
not sure we saw those.
He didn't take those risks.
What did the Conservative Party offer the youth? It was more maths till 18 and no smoking, wasn't it?
Indeed.
So look, Rishi, obviously, did they ever get close to the letters on him?
No. And I recount this in the book, and indeed the very last line of my book, I say that there had been a persistent rumour that the early election was called because I had been to see him to say, you're almost there at a confidence vote. Well, first of all, I never went to see him to say that. I never said that to any Prime Minister. And secondly, when the election was called, there were 10 letters sitting in my safe.
Same usual suspects.
Against the target of 53.
Had it ever got higher than 10 and people had taken them out? So it's just
10 was the highest.
I think you could see that in January when Simon Clarke went over the top and put the flares up
and said there were 50 letters.
And said where were the 50?
I think there were 8 at the time.
8.
But of course, I couldn't say that.
No, of course. Did you ever get tempted just to be like, to try and just calm things down?
Well, of course, it was always tempting, but I learned very, very early on that you simply can't say anything.
Not even a quizzical eyebrow raised.
Well, it was oddly, it was James Forsyth, then working for The Spectator, went on to be Rishi Sunak's political secretary, who very early in the Cameron government asked me if I'd had any letters calling for a confidence vote. And I said, James, don't be so absurd. Of course I haven't. And then he asked me again a few weeks later. And he said, I see you're not saying it's absurd anymore.
A slippery slope. You've seen leaders up close. Who do you think comes out of that 14 years with their best legacy? Or time will tell, but now.
Time will tell. I mean, inevitably, I think the Cameron government and essentially the recovery from the banking crisis, from the problems that we were left with by a Labour government. I mean, it's bizarre now listening to Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer claiming to have.
Well, it's the same playbook, isn't it?
It's the same playbook, but then it was for real. And again, I observe in the book what I'd seen as a member of the Treasury Select Committee was that Alistair Darling, the Labour Chancellor, had planned exactly the same public finances restraint that George Osborne then implemented. It suited both sides to call it austerity. Labour wanted to say it's just beastly Tories who would do it, and the Conservatives wanted to say, oh, we're being tough. It was exactly the same, and it was inevitable.
What about yourself? Did you ever fancy a little tilt at the top, seeing it up close? There was a moment where you considered it, right?
There was a moment when I considered it, and in particular that autumn when Theresa May faced the confidence vote. A significant number of colleagues said, if she goes, will you stand?
And you had to step aside. You had to recuse yourself from one bit of it.
So
that was Theresa, right?
That was when Boris Johnson was elected. But it was when I went. We were trying to get Theresa to go with some dignity, with some element of her own control. And so I had 2 or 3 meetings with her, some of which were slightly awkward. But then by the time...
Because she just didn't want to listen, or?
She obviously wanted to carry on, and she believed still that she was able to deliver something. There was sadly no evidence that it could be delivered. So at that point I went, she named the day for leaving office, and then she said, but before you leave this building today, you need to tell me whether you're going to be a candidate. Ooh. Well, the thing about being chairman of the 1922 committee and returning officer is there's no way I could have canvassed support.
Yes, of course.
So I just didn't know. I had actually quite a number of quite senior and successful people outside Parliament were urging me to do it. I had, in that sense, some of the infrastructure was there if it was wanted, but I needed to ask that. So I recused myself from running the election.
Do you think that was her revenge for forcing her out? Or?
Maybe, but
shooting the messenger more than anything.
It wasn't shooting the messenger, but I think she probably did wrongly at one point think that I might be trying to push her out for my own purposes. And actually, I tried very hard to sustain her and help the government get this objective.
How's relationships now with the former prime ministers? Is there anyone that still holds a grudge?
I don't think so. I don't know as of today.
You must see them. You must see them out and about. Though,
as of today, with the publication of my book, I don't know.
But no one's still. No one holds a grudge.
No, or nobody did.
Well, what do you recommend for, you talked about the importance of bringing the party together and unity, and is party unity more important than a coherent leadership message? That's what I think the debate between some of the candidates now who are running to succeed Rishi Sunak saying, on the one side you've got the unity first, we must have unity and then we can move on, versus maybe sort of Kemi and Jemrick candidates who are saying, you know what, unity will come if there's something to unite around. Where do you sit on that scale?
Towards the latter end of it, and I just have always. I grew up with Margaret Thatcher in Downing Street, and that was what inspired me to get involved in Conservative politics. I like conviction politics. I would also observe that mostly when disunity has become a serious problem, it's because we haven't had a clear direction. And I think that started really when John Major was adopting a wait-and-see policy over whether we would abandon the pound and adopt another currency or not. It encourages both sides to push for what they want. And if you've got a clear position, that's less likely.
Do you have a preferred candidate, or are you staying out of it?
I'm staying out of it at the moment. Of course, now
you don't have to anymore. You're free
to. As a Conservative peer, I only have a vote as a member of the Conservative Party when the final point comes, and so I'm going to wait until the final 2 are chosen by the Parliamentary Party, and then I may choose to endorse that.
How do you reckon it's going to play out at conference? Do you think there'll be the sort of beauty parade will go? Do you think there'll be a sort of defining moment, sort of Cameron versus David Davis in 2005?
I don't know. I suspect they're all practicing making speeches without notes and wandering around the stage, looking very relaxed.
Lord Brady, thank you for coming on Never Mind the Ballots. Fascinating chat. The book is out today, I think.
Indeed.
Available in all good bookshops.
Great Christmas present.
Great Christmas present, and I'll get you to sign mine at Tory Party Conference. Thank you very much. That's all we've got time for this week. Remember to subscribe, youtube.com/sunpolitics for all our episodes. See you next time.